Scary Monsters, parentheses, and Super Creeps. It's kind of like that Bryan Adams album we talked about before, or a song. Everything I do, parentheses, I do it for you. This is Scary Monsters, parentheses, and Super Creeps. In the montage, you heard Ashes to Ashes, and you will now hear Fashion. All right.
To the right.
I was about to say, so hopefully you've turned to the right and turned to the left. So this is from 1980. This is David Bowie in his third decade in the CTS run, guys. We did do a David Bowie album in the 1960s. Yep. David Bowie, sometimes also called Space Oddity, so that is in the archives. Let's do a little test, guys. How many of the 70s albums that we covered can you remember?
I can cheat because I'm looking at we have to do the numbers too, but I'm looking at the numbers right now, so I see that. So Josh, you go.
All right.
Heroes.
Correct.
Low.
Correct.
Station to Station.
Wow, you're going backwards. Okay, so from the later part to the front.
Aladdin
Okay.
Sane.
Yes,
Ziggy
but there's
Stardust.
one. Mm-hmm.
And Young Diamond Dogs. I can't
Nope.
remember.
Nope, there's one other.
Hunky Dory.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's one more after that?
Did you forget Ziggy?
No, he did that. Ziggy. It was just Hunky Dory. He forgot. Yep. So there you go. That's all the albums we covered. No, we did not cover Diamond Dogs. We did not cover The Man Who Sold the World. We did not cover Young Americans.
Or Lodger.
And, I'm going to get to Lodger in a second. There's also that cover album that I'm trying to remember the name of.
Pinups?
We also did not cover. There you go. Pinups, exactly. So
or
Lodger.
We didn't cover the David Bowie recites Peter and the Wolf also.
Right. Well, I'm not really counting that one. So
I listened to part of that. So.
The important one here is that we didn't cover Lodger, because where we're seeing Bowie right here, and I'm going to do a little bit of a quick sketch on Bowie in this one because there's a lot of bio in previous CTS episodes for those that are interested. Probably the one that will do a nice job of setting the tone for you is our bios of both Station to Station, Low, and Heroes. I think all kind of continue the narrative. So Bowie, that was the Berlin trilogy was during that time. Low first, Heroes second, and Lodger third. Low and Heroes were both 77, and Lodger was 79. So this is 1980. So Bowie had done the full Berlin trilogy. And after the Berlin trilogy, he'd received an incredible amount of critical acclaim, even though critical acclaim was not exactly something that Bowie was really ever searching for in the 70s. One thing he did not get, though, guys, was large record sales, because the Berlin trilogy were not particularly successful commercially. So it's kind of, by 1980, Bowie had kind of gotten to an interesting point where he'd influenced a ton of people with the Berlin trilogy, right? And those people had sort of taken the formula and made higher selling albums based as not necessarily on the prototype, but derivative of what he was doing on those albums. So Bowie's taking a look at this. He goes into the studio with Tony Visconti, who we've talked about a ton with Bowie in the 70s. He's kind of all over the place with him. And he goes into the studio between February and April of 1980. He's in New York City at the Power Station, which is a pretty famous recording studio, and he does a little bit of recording also in London. He brings back the band that has been with him since Station to Station, and he also brings in some big hitters. He's got a guest appearance by Pete Townsend. He's got Robert Fripp in there. He's got Chuck Hammer in there, and so he's got a lot of big hitters. And so Bowie kind of creates an album that in his mind is the prototype for the new decade, the 80s, incorporating some of that art rock he's known for with almost another... he doesn't have a persona necessarily that's associated with this, like the Thin White Duke or Ziggy Stardust, but this is sort of his movement into the 80s right here. So some have said it's kind of like a more commercial version of the stuff that he was doing in the Berlin trilogy. Needless to say, this album did get both critical and commercial success. It peaked at number 1 in the UK, and also Bowie hit number 12 in the US with this album. So, he was able to both accomplish the goal of staying very critically, considered to be sort of ahead of the curve, but also finding the recipe again for being a high-selling artist. So that's there. So that is a little bit of the piece of where David Bowie was at the time. There's a lot of there's a lot of discussion about how Visconti felt that this was sort of the Bowie album that they were, kind of working towards throughout the 70s. He felt it was sort of their Sgt. Pepper at one point. I saw him describe it as, in terms of what they had been going for. Some people consider this to be like sort of the last great album of Bowie's most prolific period. We're still very early in the game with Bowie, so we certainly can revisit that idea. But this does sort of, while it's 1980, it does sort of put coda on the on that Bowie run of the 70s, right? Like even though it's in the 80s, it kind of, to me, is the period on the end of the sentence that is Bowie's 70s run. It's also eclectic, like most Bowie is. There's elements of new wave and post-punk, art rock, some of the experimentation, things like that. Lyrically, I don't know how much you guys paid attention to that, but the thing that is described often in the research I've done is that it's, I heard it described harsh, manic, things along those lines, very reflective, and kind of veering in between things like anger and madness and craziness, and then love at different points. But they also say it's a warmer album and a more accessible album lyrically than some of Bowie's stuff. So there you go. There's a lot of interesting factoids that I'll build in, but I think I'd rather, weave it in to the discussion. So with that being said, Josh, thoughts? Scary Monsters and Super Creeps.
Not an album I had listened to before, but man, I'm glad I did. Bowie's done it again for me. I really love this album, and mark it down. It's my number one album of the 80s right now. Of the
oh wow,
I have in my range.
Strong take right there, Josh, coming out of the gates.
So I've learned from my mistakes in the past, and we'll be ranking these as we listen to them as we go this time.
Calling that the John approach.
Yes. Are you using his algorithm?
Nope, it's all heart. It's all
heart. Oh, damn.
You're like a Springsteen character.
I like that.
I definitely picked up on the fact that it was more commercial, but again, Bowie is really able to somehow be different and unique, but also make really catchy songs. The synth is all over this album, which I appreciate, but it's used in different and interesting ways, especially on songs such as like Ashes to Ashes. He's not afraid to put some, he's still dabbling in different genres. As you mentioned, there's kind of a funk bass line and fashion, and it almost reminds me of a Prince song in some ways. And just showing his originality by bookending the album with It's No Game Part 1 and 2, and including the Japanese musician who kind of sings the vocals in Japanese, and then he repeats what she's saying, but he's like screaming it almost, and his voice is really strained, and at least on the first opening track, and then it's kind of more relaxed and subdued by the time the album ends. And I was a little the first time I listened to this, I was like, okay, this is okay. I liked some songs, like Ashes to Ashes and Fashion were kind of the clear standouts for me, but the more I listened to it, the more like every song is kind of really awesome. there are some weaker songs on here, but for the most part, like a good 3/4 of the album is great, if not more than that. And he continues to use percussion in interesting ways. The guitar is still kind of front and center, different. I mean, Mick Ronson's not on this, but I think Pete Townsend makes an appearance. Is that right, John, on one of these songs?
He does. He plays guitar.
Yeah, I looked that up. It's not like I knew what Pete Townsend on guitar sounds.
Yeah, Townsend was on Because You're Young, yeah. And Robert Fripp was on many songs.
Yes.
And then the synth, which you mentioned before, Bowie plays some, Chuck Hammer plays it on a couple, and Andy Clark plays it on 4 different songs. Bowie is actually credited with vocals, synths, mellotron, electric piano, synth bass, sound effects, backing vocals, and saxophone. So wow. He was a busy man on this album.
But yeah, this is an album that really grew on me, and after I think my last great Bowie album of the 70s was Glow. I think that was the one I responded to the most of the Berlin trilogy, and so I was glad to hear this and kind of welcome back the fun, more fun inspired Bowie.
Did you ever listen to Lodger, Josh?
I did, but I didn't. It was kind of around the Heroes time that when we were having that discussion, so I don't really remember much of it and placing it in context with the other two. Nothing really stood out from what I can recall.
Gotcha. Matt, you want to jump in?
So I'm going to run the numbers first.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
Because we didn't do that. So Scary Monsters and Super Creeps comes in at number 42 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. Number 4 in 1980. Number 336 of all time. It's Bowie's 8th highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. So yeah, we've covered 7. One of them is actually the higher rated album, Black Star. We're not going to cover until the 2010s.
The sixth
like
decade.
3 years from now. And it did make Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 443. So my take on this album, I did very much like it. And I think I've really liked going into these Bowie albums because, as I mentioned before, my main knowledge, I did know Ziggy Stardust. I knew that album. But most of Bowie's stuff I knew from his greatest hits, singles double album that I got like in the 90s. And it's cool to kind of just like listen to these albums and find out which 2 or 3 songs are appearing on the record that were in this that I knew.
Oh, yeah.
And so he bunches them all up here with Scary Monsters, Ashes to Ashes, and Fashion. So I knew all of those really well. And I will have to say, like, I came out of this, like, I liked Ashes to Ashes before. I love it now. Like, that song is so great. It's got my favorite moment on the album is at the end where he does that whole other part where he's like, my mother said to get things done, you better not mess with Major Tom. And then there's this synth part in the back, this like really heavy kind of quasi distorted synth that's like almost like it's like a dramatic, menacing sound. And it sounds so great. And so it's got the great bass line. It's got that cool little pinging sound, whatever's happening there. It's probably some sort of synth. And it's that's just a great song. So I really like that. But a lot of new songs here I didn't know. I like how it opens and ends with It's No Game. I like the different versions of that, and they're kind of, the bass line there is very catchy. Teenage Wildlife might be my favorite new track that I didn't know before. That's just it's a really pretty song. I love the guitar tone on that. It's got like a very kind of distinctive, it's kind of an 80s sounding guitar tone, but it's not like a cheesy, I wouldn't say that it's like one of those cheesy 80s effects. So it is interesting. You can kind of hear the bridging from the 70s into the 80s with some of these songs. And there's a lot of effects that he does with his voice right off the bat. And he gets into really screaming, and It's No Game. He's kind of like, he's like in some sort of panic screaming mode there. But some really great deep cuts. I don't think there was a bad song on here. Up the Hill Backwards, I thought, was an interesting song because there was kind of like with the vocals there, with the background vocals, it was almost kind of like an R&B kind of funk, kind of sound. Not like that was a funky sound, but just like the vocals, it sounded like something that would be on like a funk or R&B record. And then it breaks down into like kind of like a quasi Bo Diddley beat with the guitar part. So just a lot of interesting things that he's throwing at this, and a fun listen. Bowie's great. I agree with you, Josh. This is my number 1 album of the 80s so far.
Gotcha. I agree a lot with a lot of what you guys have said. I certainly think it's higher than number 7 in terms of Bowie albums for me. Now, I know one could be like a later Bowie album, but I really like this album. And I think what was interesting about this album is, and it's mentioned often in terms of the research I did, that they say it's Bowie's most modern sounding album. And I know what they're going for there, because this does sound like an album that could have been made anytime in the late 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or even now to some degree. It has a sort of timeless quality to it. I love certain Bowies, like versions of Bowie. I like a lot of them, but there's certain ones I really like. One is a guitar-driven David Bowie. And the thing that stands out to me on this album is the guitar on this album is excellent. It really is. Like, whether it's the Robert Fripp parts, which I'm now... he was on Heroes too, and I'm starting to really get a feel for what Robert Fripp's guitar sounds like, because without even knowing he was on it, I kind of was able to pick up his guitar tone a little bit. And I just think every album that he plays on, he adds sort of a level of frenetic energy to it, which really plays well with Bowie's, like what Bowie's writing about on this, because this album there's a lot going on for Bowie, you can kind of tell, and he's pretty direct at times. I mean, you could tell he's writing about divorce. He's, in Ashes to Ashes, he's saying, Major Tom's a junkie, which, clearly, he's writing that about himself. It's probably like what his 70s was like, because we've talked at length about what that's like. He's still doing social commentary, but yeah, this struck me as more of a personal album, and the Robert Fripp guitar parts and the tone really added to it. I keep going back to, I really love his backing band, and when they delve into things that have a funk background, which goes all the way back to that Plastic Soul Bowie when he was playing around with that, but it's there. I just really like the funk version of David Bowie too. I know you guys love the term danceable, and there is a danceability to it, but not like in a go to the club danceable. It's more like, I find it to be more like danceable in the like dancing in your own house or apartment type way,
or just bobbing your head, kind of just like kind of bouncing. It's got like a bouncy nature to it.
Yes, it's very interesting because you sometimes sonically it's catchy, the music he's making, but I'm not going to say it's ominous, but that in bobbing your head at it, you're not listening to something frivolous either. That's
right.
Does that make sense? There's like a little bit of a sinister element under it.
It's not like ear candy, like bubblegum pop stuff. It's there's something more to it than that.
Yeah, like it sort of seduces you and you gravitate towards it, but you also sort of know that in bobbing your head, there's a part of you, if you're not paying attention really quickly, you're like, I'm sure I'm missing something here. So like, what am I bobbing my head to here? And different stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So that element is here. But yeah, this is a very mature David Bowie. I feel like he has a real grasp of what he's trying to do, and instead of sort of, the shape-shifting that was so quick, that was highly entertaining for me, but you do feel the turmoil for Bowie. I feel like this is a more lived-in Bowie to some degree, like a post-trauma Bowie, I would almost say, where he's almost like writing the equivalent of his memoirs of the 70s, I feel like, is how I processed his lyrics. And sonically, yeah, it's a dance album, with still some of the elements of the Plastic Soul going over. I really like this album. And it also rewards repeat listening, which I think you guys have both mentioned before. And just, it's amazing how Bowie just sneaks these albums and you're like, oh, I'm aware of it, but holy cow, that album's fantastic too. And next thing you know, you're trying to figure out, in my case, it's like, did I like Station to Station or Low better? And oh wait, can Ziggy Stardust actually be my third favorite Bowie album of the 70s? That seems crazy, different stuff like that. So, and then you like an album like Heroes, which I really liked. You're like, I don't know, that might only be my fifth best Bowie. Yeah. And you're like, Jesus, that would be like any other guy's best, almost like you undersell it because you're like, well, it's not low, but
Yeah, he's entered like the Beatles territory, right? Where you can make a good argument for just about any album he's put out, like up until.
And it's kind of what sonic palette you're looking for. Really, that's kind of, do you want more experimental? Okay, Berlin Trilogy. Do you want more danceable? You could do this, or you could do Station to Station, because he's got, disco done right on that. Do you want more proggy or glammy? Okay, Ziggy Stardust is there. Maybe even a little bit of Aladdin Sane. Do you want, old school 50s rock sound? Well, you got a little bit of that in pop and Hunky Dory, right? And if you like piano, Hunky Dory. So you've got all of these different sounds, along the way sonic palette, and that's really what I like about him, because there's nuts and bolts parts of Bowie's sound, but he's always varying it, and creating those personas, and still feeling as if he's a couple years ahead of everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, after the Berlin Trilogy, which upon reflection is kind of more somber and maybe contemplative and experimenting with the krautrock, this feels lighter, even though maybe the lyrics aren't necessarily light. It just feels, like you said, the maturity is there, and maybe just a bit of fun is back into the music.
Well, and I should also mention that one thing we haven't really touched on a lot, because it's kind of just coming now, but I've talked about, is that idea of like the new romantic sound that becomes huge in Great Britain in the early 80s. And there's definitely proto elements of the new romantic sound in this, which might be a little bit of what you're hearing, Josh. The smoothing, and we did, we covered like Roxy music and stuff that, but earlier, 74 Roxy, so they're not full on new romantic at this point, or at that point, right? Like they would be later, but we will be spending a fair amount of time with some of the British albums that we cover in new romantic, and then of course there's the more pop version of it that comes out in things like, Duran Duran or Spandau Ballet and stuff like that, orchestral maneuvers in the dark, those things. But that's a sound that's coming. And while we haven't talked about it yet, I do feel the need to say, like, I'm familiar with some of that sound. And certainly there's elements of laying the train tracks for that here.
Yep.
Yeah, I like seeing how, just because I didn't look at this beforehand, but I like just hearing, and then this person played on here, and this person, like Robert Fripp and Pete Townsend, and he's always got people like this. Also played on here was the Professor, Roy Baton from the E Street Band, played on a piano on a couple of tracks here. So I like how that they just sneak that in there, like artists that from like other bands or other people, and then just like, they're just contributing to a Bowie album, and that's it. And you wouldn't have known that otherwise unless you looked it up on Wikipedia or read about it. So I think that's cool.
Well, there's all kinds of interesting anecdotes about this album too, like the fact that Bowie was close to John Lennon, and later in 1980 it came out that actually Lennon's assassin had also entertained the idea of David Bowie. But in the aftermath of this, Bowie became a little bit of a recluse because it shook him a little bit, but there was different stuff like that, so that's one thing that's there.
Wasn't there a story? Wasn't there a story like right after Lennon was killed, Bowie gave a concert and he was looking at two seats that were supposed to be occupied by Yoko and John Lennon, but it was like right after he died. It was like it really affected him.
Yep, it's there. The title track of the album dates back to like 1975 when Bowie was playing this for Iggy Pop, so that's how far back Scary Monsters Super Creeps goes back. It's also, did you guys catch an inspiration in that song, Scary Monsters and Super Creeps? And I did as I listened. Did you catch the drums? Did you hear what the drums sounded like? Because I caught it right away.
Kind of like a drum machine or something.
Well, it was inspired by the sound that's of Stephen Morris on She's Lost Control by Joy Division.
Oh, God, no. No,
for sure. If you go back and listen to it, you will definitely hear it. Yep. Did you catch David Bowie using a Cockney accent, by the way?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Okay, that's in there. So that was a personal choice. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then there's also like his inspiration. There was Teenage Wildlife was supposed to be sort of his take on a Ronette song, albeit a much longer version of it, which I thought was very interesting. So there's all kinds of stuff. There's also like Bowie writing an American AOR song, as they described it, which is what Kingdom Come is supposed to be. It's like Motown meets American AOR was how it was described, which I thought was an interesting combo. So yeah, there's a lot of anecdotes on this album. It's an interesting album to read about. With that being said, I think it's very much like a continuation of Bowie as opposed to like an album where it's like this marks this definitive shift, right? I think it was more of a continuation of the tricks that he's learned.
Yeah, I would agree with it. No, it's like I said. I mean, there's marks of the '70s, but also the '80s here, and it kind of blends together a little bit overall with the sound. I agree. I didn't really notice a huge difference sonically between this and some of the other stuff that he had done in the late '70s, but it's all really good. Like he's just an immensely talented person, and I'm glad we're going through all these albums so I get to know more than just the quote unquote singles, the hits. So. Right.
Yeah, and I'll be curious when we start covering new romantic stuff if we can pull even more out of this album than we got the first time. Because I do feel, there's those albums we cover and then we're like, geez, as we listen to more stuff, boy, we start to realize how this album really played. I do feel like for the 80s, I feel this is ahead of where the 80s sound is going. So when we start to hear where it goes, kind of like how we're starting to get to the stuff that Low inspired, and you start to hear it and you're like, oh yeah, I get that, like how Low came, stuff came from Low. I wonder if that's going to be something in like when we get to like albums in 1982, we're like, well, yeah, definitely Scary Monsters Super Creeps was an influence on that. I have a feeling that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
I
and
can
we're
see
only
it.
covering. I think we're covering Bowie one more time in the '80s, right? We're doing Let's Dance, right?
Let's Dance. Are we doing Let's Dance?
Are we
Maybe.
not? I made Rolling Stones list. I think. I thought that's
Okay,
what
maybe
we
it's
might
in
be covering
Rolling
it.
Stones. Okay, yeah. So
I hope
if
so.
it did,
That's got some
if it-
bangers on it, man.
yeah, if it did, we're going to be covering it. And as I showed you guys, the Mick Jagger, David
Yes,
Bowie,
we cover Let's Dance.
Dancing in the Street is on that one, right?
On
And that's the
seventh
ultimate
episode of Coldest and Hot Takes.
memeable. That's becoming the ultimate memeable thing, isn't it? And,
Yeah, he
and of
doesn't.
course-
For as much as he did in the '70s, it doesn't sound like it doesn't look like he had a ton of output in the '80s.
Well, he kind of tried to reinvent himself in the
Labyrinth.
late '80s. It was kind of the first time where
That's
he
true.
kind of felt he kind of couldn't get it right, And then in the '90s, he sort of reinvented himself as a electronic music because
Right.
he's around Trent Reznor and
Trent
stuff,
Reznor,
and like
yes,
the
I remember
house
that.
music and stuff. But yeah, the late '80s I know is like the first time when kind of he didn't quite get it right. Is how I always remember it being described. So. Maybe I'll go into that a little bit more when we cover Let's Dance.
Hey, that's the best artist, though. I mean, the best guys are the ones. They still try to. They try to do something. It doesn't really work out. They kind of have a bunch of crappy albums, or they kind of go away for a while to figure stuff out. And it's hard to keep it up after decade.
He also married Iman and probably got peace of mind. And
Yeah.
I think we all know that when people get happy, their music starts to suck.
It sure does.
Yeah, and I mean that's
why I'd
the
be a
ultimate
terrible
thing.
musician, John. I'm too happy.
You just want people to be happy, so you hate the idea that you're oh no, stay unhappy so you make great music. But yeah, you just kind of not a lot of people write what I consider to be good music when they're super content.
Yeah, Bowie had 4 albums in the 1980s. He had this, Let's Dance in '83, Tonight in '84, and Never Let Me Down in '87.
There you go. Okay. Well, maybe I'll do, like I said, when we get to Let's Dance, maybe I'll do a little bit of a quick bullet point retrospective of what those sound like. We'll maybe do it for Neil Young too, because he had an interesting '80s as well. So, but yeah, I think, is it fair to say before I kick it over to Matt that 3 pretty big thumbs up?
I would say that.
I would, yes, I like this album quite a bit.
Yeah, me too. I liked it a lot.